Welcome to Thoughts on Humanity, our second episode. So, Lisa, in our first episode, you interviewed me, and today, by request from various readers online, we're reversing the table and I'm interviewing you. How are you feeling about this?
I'm pretty excited. I just think bring it on. Let's see what happens.
All right. So, when you interviewed me, I had just recently done a podcast with a fellow Fabio that I had met through the writing website Medium, and he had invited me onto his podcast to talk about language and learning journals and those types of things. And you had started our interview asking me about my experience with that. And you've had a pretty interesting experience since we did our interview. I think it was up over 100 views here on YouTube. And you had written a Medium article about your experience of interviewing me. And I think it's been, if I recall correctly, one of your most popular articles yet on Medium. Wonder if you can share a little bit about that process and your thoughts on it.
Well, I think it's a pretty unique experience to be able to interview your spouse. And it's not something we necessarily even do when we first meet a person. Not that we're looking for that formality when we first get together. But I think for me, it was about an opportunity to explore who you are in an avenue or an environment where we're not sitting at the kitchen table or talking about bills or rushing off to see who's picking up the kids or what's for dinner, stuff like that. So for me, it was a experience that I think helped me humanize you in a way outside of our normal roles. And so just kind of reflecting on how different that was for me, I thought, why not write about it? And then my first thought was like, well, who's gonna read that? Like, who really cares? And I said to myself, I don't really give a shit. It was my experience. I like writing about my own experiences. And yeah, it's been one of my most popular articles. So yeah, it was fun. So thanks for being a good sport.
It's pretty funny that it's gained that much, and I guess from what I understand as well, some folks have said there in the comments about, hey, when are you guys reversing the tables? Was that in the Medium article comments?
Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. So one of the things that we had talked about, and we did this in a few different pieces, we've put together a course on learning journals. We've had some other courses that we've pulled together. It's just this idea of the Humanity Academy. And so before we get into that, I was just curious to ask you a little bit more about that interview and the fact that you are a professional counselor by training, and that's what you do. I think you're just coming from appointments, even today in your office, and how much of a shift that was. Did you find it was challenging when you were interviewing me to be able to shut off the counselor, or were you in a bit of a both and type of relationship with yourself?
I think that's a great question. I think even myself, I can feel myself sitting kind of more in a professional way of being, but also grappling with myself of calling more authentic Lisa into the room. Not that I'm not authentic when I'm counseling, but there's a lot of things that I can't just show up as I am working with somebody. We all wear different hats, and so just making a really conscious effort on what hat am I going to wear, and with you as my partner, I think for me, in a way, there was this little bit of a twist of like, huh, I get to maybe have a little bit of the upper hand, or I get to maybe control the space a little bit. So not necessarily that's what I was looking for, but it's just a different dynamic, right? Because I think we live our lives on pretty equal playing fields. And then when you're getting interviewed or you're interviewing someone, that shifts the dynamic.
Absolutely. So in one of the pieces that we did for the Learning Journal course, which is now up and posted, in one of those discussions that we had, and I think it's also posted here openly on YouTube, we talked a little bit about this title, Humanity Academy. And so this is an educational startup that you and I started in, let's say, the summer of 2023. And it's a name that you came up with. And I recall when we were chatting about it before, one of the reasons you like it is because you're a poet and you like the sound of it. But I'm wondering if you could share a bit more around your thinking on why that title, the Humanity Academy.
That's a great question. I think it's really important. We've got three kids that are in school. We've gone through so much school ourselves, especially post-secondary, and not one of those courses really set the tone or provided the grace and the space to explore what does it mean to actually be a human. We could go and take philosophy courses, for example, and while that's all well and good, what does it actually mean to be a human in today's world? And so thinking about what could it look like where we can empower people to be the experts on who they are and just offer some insight and maybe some questions and just different methods to support their own journey into becoming who they are. There's no desire to tell people how to live. I think that's where the motto or kind of our saying is there's no one right way to live. And there's a lot of courses that tell you this is how it is. Here's a framework for doing this said thing. And with Humanity Academy, I think in the idea in my head initially was, what if we just had the space where people could explore what it's like to be human for them? So empowering an individual to gain more self-knowledge as opposed to external knowledge telling them who they are. We're bombarded enough with that as it is.
Absolutely. So you had mentioned questions, and we have a common saying around that. So yeah, one of our main mottos, which is a saying of yours, there is no one right way to live. There's another one we use about questions. Wonder if you could share a little what that is and some thoughts around why that carries meaning for you, especially. I think we could make some assumptions as a professional counselor why that carries meaning, but my assumptions and my guess is it carries more meaning as well for you on why you use this phrase around questions.
Well, yeah, the motto is we've got questions, you've got answers. And one of the deepest human needs or desires is to be known. And to be known, it can take some inquiry into that. And questions could be a really beautiful tool into exploring, like, who are you? What's sort of the meat and potatoes, or for like the vegans out there, what's the roots that's coming in to create who you are, supporting who you are as a person? And that is what I do professionally. I ask a lot of hard questions. I just had a client leave today and he's like, man, you kicked my ass today. All these hard questions. And it's like, well, yeah, that's what you pay me to do. It gives you an opportunity to get to know you better. And so carefully crafted questions can really help open up the avenues to the human spirit.
Absolutely. So I'll lead up, I think, to a few questions. We'll see how this goes. You and I tend to be pretty fluid in these types of processes, from facilitating to doing sessions to teaching. We tend to be pretty fluid and flexible. But I'm really interested in this idea of identity and some of your thoughts on being a human and some of your choices as well, and in the work that you're doing and the work that you want to do and the work that you've done. We talk about those ideas. But there's a saying that you use a lot, and I've heard it more frequently in the last little while in our conversations around home or on our walks. And I'm just interested to hear some of your thoughts around it. And you'll often say, so and so is a good human. And it's a really common saying I find when you're talking about folks. And I'm wondering if you could just share a bit more about what that means to you and why you tend to use it.
So speaking to someone being a good human, I think for me at the core, it relates to their ability to just be genuine in who they are and show up authentically. There's no dissonance between what I am seeing and hearing and what I'm experiencing. It feels like there's, in the clinical world, we call it congruence, where what we're seeing, what they're saying, and what we're feeling can sort of align. And so it sounds like a qualification. There's a lot of good, beautiful humans out there, but what I mean is, I guess, the spirit of who they are resonates with me, and maybe someone that I can feel safe around, or someone that I find really intriguing or curious, or someone that's just really good at being who they are. And I can think of a few people in my life who are now since passed on, and one is my maternal grandmother. She's a good human. She's good at just being who she was. Like, what you see is what you get. She's a classy woman. I was really careful where she gave her shits, and just kind of said whatever came to mind, and I really appreciated her approach to life.
Yeah, I can certainly concur with that with my experience. She was just not a whole lot of bullshit there. And sometimes you mentioned this as well about authenticity and genuineness, and we see a lot of that in social media. You and I talk about it. Last year, the Merriam-Webster dictionary said authentic was the word of the year. Lots of this being explored with artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning. But certainly something with your grandmother, I certainly experienced. She was very authentic and genuine, but that didn't mean it jived with everybody because she was quite point blank in the way that she lived her life. So I just thinking about that, and I had some questions further down around that. You've already beat me to it. But that idea of authenticity and genuineness, because it's come up in some of the training and the courses we're developing, and I know you're in the midst of working on a course that's been a struggle at times, but it also is around authenticity and genuineness. So I'm curious, it's a bit of a two-part question. And one goes to the personal and the other to the professional. And I'll start with the professional. So, what are the types of things, or do you have strategies or systems, or is it very fluid in how you support clients or folks that come to see you around being their authentic and genuine self? And then I'm curious, the next part of that is around yourself and how you do that.
I'd say it's an absolute impossible question to answer because every person is an individual. And so I will try and provide the space and the safety for that person to show up as they are. And it depends where the questions go. Generally, when I'm working with clients, I start with a genogram, and that is a map of who made us. And as we begin to explore that map, there are stories that sort of emerge that can highlight, oh, maybe that's why I am the way that I am, or that's where I got that from. It's much more deeper and nuanced than that. So, because everyone is a unique person, just kind of getting to know some of the quirks, some of the unique things about that human, I want to be able to get people get to know them as well as I can so that I can do my best to provide maybe some tools and insight and some perspectives and really craft more questions is what it's about so that there's an opening for safe exploration of where to go. And sometimes there's some gentle challenging in there. And I wonder, I think a lot of my clients are attracted to coming to see me because I take a no bullshit approach and can be a bit of a jokester, often very blunt. That doesn't work for everyone, and that's okay. I don't expect to be everybody's cup of tea, but if I'm sort of now kind of leaning into that question of the personal, I show up as Lisa, as a counselor. I just happen to have my counselor hat on. There's some things that, of course, I wouldn't say in session, but it also depends on the client, right? And so some clients really appreciate, to hear me swear. That can be one of the most disarming experiences for them to know, holy shit, you're a person too. So then that gives me the grace and the space to be able to show up as who I am. So the more that I can be who I am, it invites them to be more of who they are, and just creating that space to continue to journey into that realm of becoming human, because we're all becoming. There's no finished product.
Absolutely. And I figured that would probably be the answer to your question. So I had a follow-up to that. So that's on the professional side. And certainly hearing echoes of your grandmother in there, the no bullshit approach. So I'm curious then about the personal side, and maybe there is no distinction for you. We talk about this a lot, I've said it often, this idea of work-life balance is often bullshit, especially if you're a solopreneur, because what happens when you get too much life on that apparent scale? So I'm just curious on the personal side, some of your thoughts and reflections on that idea of being genuine and authentic.
I think that's so there's two parts to that. Actually, there's probably 1,000 parts to that. But what's
Yeah.
coming to me right now is a gift that I got from my father. He was, or still is, very social, quite gregarious. He was friends with all ages. He's really good with little kids. And then I could see him really connect with people who were elderly. And growing up with that as a kid, that was just normalized, that you could just be who you are with anybody. And I remember one time I think we got stopped by the cops, or he speeds a lot, or we're talking to a cop, or there's some sort of police officer involved. And I remember as a kid just kind of being like, this is really scary. And he noticed that in me, and he was just having a normal conversation with this guy. Maybe we had seen a moose that got hit on the highway. I can't remember. And anyways, after he said to me, they're just real people too. And the age that I was at, I was probably like 7 or 8, just a really formative time. And it really humanized that profession for me and other professions too. Like that was a transferable sort of relationship of going like, oh, doctors are just people too, or pilots are just people too. And just really shifting the way that I had viewed professions and people, and recognizing, wait a second, it's people that do these professions. So that it was really important to me to show up as a people in my profession. And then the second main influencer on that for me wasn't people at all. For, well, my entire life, I've been obsessed with horses, but I was a professional horse trainer for quite some time. And every horse is different. And horses are one of the best bullshit meters, as most animals are. If I was to show up in the arena with an agenda, that horse would turn it instantly. They've got autonomy, they've got agency, they've got authority over their being. Plus, they've got, 1,000 to 1,500 pounds on me. So, really adjusting who I am in myself and how I approach the work. I know it sounds like I'm talking about the professional here, but the personal, I am a person going in and doing this work. And so really sitting in myself, becoming more aware of my emotional atmosphere and the atmosphere around me and what's going on with that horse too. What do I need to adjust in myself to be able to invite them to feel safe so that we can journey along together, as opposed to coming in with this dominance and then they feel they need to submit. And that just creates a whole, whack ton of problems. And I see that a lot with clients coming in for counseling. Often someone took their agency away, and
Hmm.
taking away agency tarnishes authenticity. And so how can we invite an environment where we can start to polish that up and really recognize, hey, you're a unique human. Let's be proud of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we must live in the same house and talk a lot, because I just wrote a post yesterday and even today talking about the relationship between authenticity, starting with AUTH, author, being authentic in these different places, and then having authority, and how that can be a two-way street. And there was a couple of questions in here that I had thought through as I was preparing for this, and I want to make sure I try and go through them carefully. And one of them was to go down a bit of the path on equine facilitated wellness, because that is an area that you are trained in. I think you, if I recall correctly, are very close to being one of the few triple certified in Canada in those aspects. And just at the same time, I've always found it very fascinating that you as a person have a very high startle reflex. And sometimes in this household, maybe even me, I might take some pleasure in getting that startle reflex. However, you've talked about this in the nature of the work that you do with horses, that a startle reflex could kill you in certain
Mhm.
situations. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more of your thoughts about that. It's a bit of a broad question, but go where you want with it, because I think equine facilitated wellness is just such a I'm scared shitless of horses. You've known that since we've met. And at the same time, you have trained horses. You have what some people would call broke horses or started them, I think is the
Mhm.
appropriate term.
Mhm.
You've trained riders to ride them, and then you also use horses in therapy, and it's a really fascinating combo. So it's a bit of a broad arena, but kind of an open invite for you to go where you want with that.
So I would
No
just,
pun intended on the arena, by the way.
if someone says they use horses in therapy, I would walk away slowly and just be like, ooh, we partner with horses. They're their own sentient beings. They are the ones that help hold the space. So really, they are a co-therapist. So just really wanting to make that abundantly clear. For myself, Horses are sort of what led me into the psychology realm. I've owned horses my whole life. And when I first started post-secondary, I went in to study psychology, and I can't remember if it was like a Psych 101 prof. I mean, this was 1,000 years ago. And I said to him, I want to work with animals in a therapeutic setting. Is this a thing? And he's like, no, that's not a thing. I've never heard of it. Why would anyone want to work with horses and counseling? Like, it was just such a novel concept that it was poo-pooed. And I thought, well, that's bullshit, because I wouldn't be on the planet if it wasn't for horses. My bond with animals has allowed me to be human in some ways that I can't even put into words. And I think it was Temple Grandin wrote this beautiful book, Animals Make Us Human. And just not everyone is into animals, and that's fine. For many sensitive types, I would put myself in that category. Animals have always been a insulating relationship in this hustle and bustle life that we live in. And so it was really that time in post-secondary where I felt I was challenged by this prof, and I thought, well, I'm going to find a way. And I did more research. So over about 15 years on and off, I would do research and go, what's out there? And so finally in 2013, I made my decision on what avenue I wanted to go down and started my training with someone who was a counselor. This was more than just a weekend course. It took me years to complete all of the training. And one of the biggest things that I learned there, especially coming from a horse training background and someone that just rode, right? I rode my horses, was most of the therapy exists from a distance, in witnessing a horse just being a horse, or just standing there and grooming a horse, or feeding a horse, or listening to a horse story, or just being in a barn. And that really shifted my perspective, because historically for me, that was all prep for work, right? There was always an agenda. And so to shift that paradigm for me was really profound, and it shifted my relationship with horses as well. And I remember when I first met you, you had said, why can't a horse just be a horse? Why can't they just be out in the pasture? And I just thought, man, that's like blasphemy. You can't just have a horse just out in a pasture. Like, that concept was just so foreign to me, because, horses were to be used. That's the world that I grew up in. And so as I shifted how I viewed horses, it also helped me shift how I had viewed humans, right? So just being in the world, why can't we just have value as we exist? So that's sort of the lesson that I got out of that. It's been a while since I've done equine therapy. I sold my herd, 6 years now, something like that.
Oh, that, yeah.
So yeah, which was probably, other than choosing to become a mother, that was the hardest decision I've ever made in my life, because I've always owned horses. So that's been a bit of transition. It doesn't mean that horses don't have a therapeutic role in my life. I still paint them. You still make fun of me for still painting them. But just a really powerful being. They will always have an important place in my life. And maybe one day I do get back to it.
Although you've moved to birds recently, so it's been more birds than horses. So curious, maybe I was just thinking about that as you were sharing about my comment about horses just yesterday, Saturday maybe. We were out for a walk near our place and saw a huge gray owl, and I was trying to get a photo of it, and you were like, just let the owl be an owl. And it was quite a neat experience. So maybe we shifted some roles. I figured some questions about horses would take you into lots about you. And there's no question your affinity and love for horses, they've also almost killed you. And I'm just wondering if you might share a little bit about that. And you were nearly killed by one that you had a sense about, if I recall the story correctly. And you correct that if I've got it wrong. It still continued that relationship afterwards. And I'm just wondering if you're comfortable sharing a little bit about that experience.
Okay, so I can't actually specifically recall the one, because there's been
Fair.
so many in which I've been injured by, and I would say 100% have all been human error. There was no horse that tried to hurt me out of malice. Horses respond from fear, pain, and protection, just like humans do. And so, probably in my earlier career in training horses, with a little bit of like rah rah, I'm going to be world champion attitude, which, I don't blame her at the time, her being my younger self. She had some pretty lofty goals and she didn't quite meet them. That wasn't quite her path. And so, in trying to meet some of those goals, made some choices to get on some horses and sort of push the envelope to see where she could have gotten. And there was once I was training a wild horse and she was going just lovely. I was training on my own. I was at the farm. My little guy was in daycare. No one was there. It was normal for me to ride 8, 10 horses a day alone on the farm. That's just how it was. And I remember I was leading her back to the horse trailer and she had reared up and kicked me in the back of the head and knocked my hat
Mhm.
off. And I just remembered getting really angry. And I've since had conversations in my head with that horse and thank her for kind of giving me a wake-up call of you need to do things differently. And when I got angry at her, I didn't hurt her. I didn't react. I took a moment after I picked up my hat and then realized I was bleeding from my head and thought I should probably go to the hospital, and just quietly untacked her as well as I could and put her back in the pasture. She just wasn't ready for that next step. And what had happened was things were going so well, and one thing went well, another thing went well. And I thought, let's see if we can do one more thing well.
Mhm.
And that's about learning your limits and also being empathetic to other people have their own limits. And just because we think something's possible doesn't mean everyone's ready for it in that moment. So it was about boundaries. She was setting a boundary with me, and it gave me a couple days off work because I was all stitched up and probably had a mild concussion, and just, some time to think, oh, maybe this isn't necessarily the direction that I want to go in my life. Am I doing this to try and prove to someone that I can, or is this where my heart lives?
Hmm. It's interesting. It's leading me to some of the questions I wanted to ask about the course you've been working on, but we'll get there in a moment. There's another part of your life where you find yourself, I would say, if that's fair to say, and you can walk me back if I'm wrong on that. You are also a licensed truck driver, drive a big truck, and you can operate pretty much any piece of machinery. You grew up on a farm, but you also talked about it, and you mentioned this to me the other day, and I find it fascinating, and it's absolutely speaks to this idea of there's no one right way to live. And we were talking about the idea of, the fuss around yoga and meditation and mindfulness. And we talk about that quite a bit and say there's no one right way to do any of those types of things as well. And you were talking about this idea of finding deep mindfulness while running machinery.
Mm.
So that's another part of your identity. And I've seen it when you've been running machinery. You're in a happy place. And it's remarkable to see. So can you share a bit more about that part of your life and even your identity, if that is a fair thing to say?
So I've been operating equipment for nearly 40 years. I've been riding on equipment since before I was born. I was born during harvest time, which meant babies are portable, babies go into the combine. And so the hum of the engine and maybe some of the back and forth of harvest was something that sort of built itself into my being. Yeah, I was about 7 when I started operating a skid steer, and then graduated to a tractor and a baler, and then graduated to combine. And then when I was 14, I started driving a semi truck, and then got my license in Alberta. I think I was 18, 19, maybe, when I got that license. And operating for me, and I remember my dad saying this quite a bit. He's like, you're either an operator or you're a button pusher. What he meant by that was an operator is someone who becomes the machine. And when I was first learning to operate a backhoe, I just flowed into just being part of it. Like it was neat because it was like you became part robot, but I guess it was more hydraulic and less robotic. But just that being part of the equipment. And I used to work in the oil field. Well, before I met you, that's what I was doing, is working in the oil field, removing snow. And you're working in a really dangerous environment. It's also really freaking cold. Like I remember one day it was minus 52 and snow still needed to get plowed because we need our oil. And just getting out there and doing it and just forgetting about the world and just really getting into this routine of being. It was just, yeah, it was meditative for me, the hum of the engine, and just part of me too felt like I was in nature. Even though I'm inside of this machine, I'm still in a place where there's no people. I'm surrounded by forests and fields.
Absolutely. Well, and I often marvel at this, and I think joke about it. We might have even joked about it in interviews. So you grew up north central, rural Alberta. I grew up rural northwest coast of BC, 80 kilometers off the coast of BC on remote islands. And I've spent some time where you grew up. You've spent some time where I grew up. We used to go out every summer pre-pandemic. And I've always marveled at the fact that we could drive by any field in BC or Alberta, and you can probably tell me from 5 kilometers what is growing in the field or what was planted. Oh, those are peas or oats or barley. And similarly, when we get out to Haida Gwaii, I could tell you pretty much which whale was surfacing, what species of salmon was jumping by the way that it jumped. And so you've been working on a course focused on identity, basically the time ageless question of who am I? And we've talked about it for quite some time, and you've been working for quite some time. And I would really appreciate if you could share some of your perspectives on the struggles that you've had with that course, because you've shared. I imagine if you have clients or folks you've worked with to watch this interview, they'll go, "Holy shit, I had no idea. Lisa can drive truck." Certainly part of your identity. Can you share a bit around some of those struggles with that course? And it very much, I find, from what you've been working on, because I've got inside knowledge, links to what we've been talking about, this idea of who am I and identities, and that link between the past, the present, and the future.
Yeah, that's a really big question to answer. I would say some of it was inspired by some of the points of growth from my clients. Probably two or three of the most salient questions or challenges that people are bringing is, who am I? And how do I connect with my emotions? And what is an inner child? All of those things are all mishmashed up. And so I wanted to sort of tease that apart so it was more accessible for people to access and that they could work through at their own pace. So you've kind of named some of my own identities. My origin story, yes, comes from the prairies. And for me, when I went to university in Edmonton, I went from a rural way of living right into the heart. I was living in the on Jasper 111, right downtown Edmonton, basically. And that was a big shock to my identity because I couldn't just escape to quiet. And I lived in this place that was constantly bombarded by sound and lights. There was City Center Airport at the time in Edmonton, so there's planes going over top of my apartment. And I tried so much to fit into the culture that I found myself in, but to not much avail. And I guess sort of my conduit to my past farming self, I became a bike mechanic. I was Edmonton's only female bike mechanic at the time. This is bicycles, Western Cycle 1,000 years ago. And so kind of reflecting on some of the roles that I've experienced and chosen in this life, thought, okay, what would it look like to unpack this? Both you and I have done some of our post-secondary education theses and final projects with the framework of autoethnography. And that was something that I really got introduced by you when you were doing your master's. And as I was completing my master's, I thought, ooh, I would like to do an exploration of person of the counselor. And that was sort of something that really opened the doors, I think, kind of unconsciously into this course that I started of who are you? And I thought, shit, man, I got to figure that out for myself first before I can create something. But when in doubt, begin. And so that autoethnography experience of yourself and my own introduced me to the Culturegram by Hee-Wong Chang. I
Mhm.
reached out to her. She's a professor in the US, and just asked her permission. Hey, would you be cool if I used this framework and built on it for a course? And she said, yeah, go ahead. And it's just such a really neat web to start building off of as points to start by, instead of just like, write me a 2,500 word essay on who are you? Like on what day? Like right now?
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to be the same person tomorrow. So having those reference points, I think, is a bit parallel to counseling. Counseling, for me anyways, in my approach, creates an environment where we can have these reference points to go, who am I as this? Or how did this experience influence who I am? And so that was sort of my goal. And I thought, I got to work through this myself, and got hung up in a few places, and it just needed some time to marinate. So since then, I've been working on it again, almost done the first chapter, which has, I think, 5 modules right now. And we just start with your name. It's the one thing that we really own. We can change it
Mhm.
if we want to. We love when we hear our name being called, generally, for the most part, right? There's been some MRI studies that show like brain lights up. We hear our name, probably the same in dogs, or we just give eye contact and they're like, ooh, you love me. So that's where
Might
we
not be
start on the
that different
course.
for humans.
Yeah, it might not be that different for humans. Yeah, like, oh, you're looking at me. Oh, it must be love.
So interesting you bring that up. So autoethnography, some folks may be familiar with it, others not. It's kind of like autobiography, which most people are familiar with, memoir. That it's autobiography, auto meaning self. We were talking about that earlier. It's the same roots as authentic and authoring. Ethno means cultures. So exploring one's self within cultures, because there's many of them, which are all wrapped up in identity. Our names are often wrapped up in culture, language, all of these types of things. And the graphy part in autoethnography is basically the writing or the sketching or the drawing or the painting. There's so many different ways in which we can make marks. And so
Mhm.
autoethnography is something we've talked a lot about. So even if we were to ask folks that are listening to this to think back about the number of cultures that you have navigated in, trucker culture, farming culture, prairie culture, bike mechanic culture, city. We all navigate through these. There's something that you will often share, and I think this is part of your course, and maybe it's not. It's a saying as well that you use quite frequently, this idea of being friends with oneself. So how do I be a friend to myself? And I think you work with clients on that. Can you share a bit of thinking, thoughts, reflections on why you use that phrase and why it's important to you?
Yeah, no, I think too, in the age of social media, that the concept of friending has become such a powerful tool. This week alone, I've encountered clients where they're like, oh, I've unfriended that person, or I've added them on Snap. So this concept of accruing, people that are familiar, or people that might boost our social status or give us a feeling of being loved or part of. Since humans have been humans, we are creatures of community and really rely heavily upon those people we're surrounded by. What we're not taught to do is how to connect and be friends with ourselves. We are the longest relationship that we will have out of anything and anyone. And so why not like that person? And for me personally, I have been on my own private journey of becoming friends with myself and really understanding what that means. I'm going to write about that very soon, but I can appreciate what it's like to not like yourself very much. Maybe to the point of not wanting to be on the planet anymore. And so turning that around and coming to a place of, wow, some of the best things or times in my life haven't happened yet. And I remember the first time I heard that, it really awakened something inside of me to go, we all have something to look forward to. And for some of us, it's just getting to know who we are better, being friends with ourselves.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that. And it's also fueled when we started Humanity Academy, sat down and talked about the gaps that traditional education largely leaves, both in our experiences raising three kids in a double blended family and their experiences and what like, wow, there's pieces that are missing in the system. And it's not necessarily meant bad or good. It's not necessarily a judgment. It's just that piece around emotional literacy is not necessarily being taught as much as it could. Sometimes there's one course on interpersonal communication you can take in a certain degree or otherwise. And you've been unpacking these different pieces. So when we started, you went into a flurry of activity, if I recall correctly, and you can walk me back on my
Shocking.
selective memories. And one of the things that stands out in my mind was, and I think you wrote 6 courses. So we have free 5-day free educational email courses. And I can't recall if you had brought it up or we had it in conversation around what are the gaps that you're seeing, because you've been a counselor for how long now?
10 years.
And
Well,
you
or my
had
whole
said,
life.
yeah, exactly. Well, and so in this, getting the training and going through and seeing clients and working with clients has been about a decade. And you're like, here's the gaps that I see. Boom, boom,
Mhm.
boom, 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 boom. Sat down, and I think over probably a period of about 2 weeks, wrote the content for the courses, and now we have them posted. Can you recall what some of those courses were? And I think between the two of us, we can work through what the first 7 courses, free courses in Humanity Academy were that we developed and why those came to mind first.
The one that's coming to mind first about the ones that came to mind first are the So You Want to Get Married.
Yes.
And our history is we met online. 4 months later, we got married. We can put the link in the comment section about that story. Unpacking it would take a couple hours.
From both
And
sides. I wrote
on
about it.
both
You wrote
sides.
about it.
And then the boundaries blueprint.
Yep.
And then the inner child, and that's been the least popular, and that's fair because most people are like, and this is with my clients too. And so many people I encounter, a lot of people don't want to admit or to interact with their inner child because that brings up a lot, and we're not always prepared to handle what is going to be unpacked. And so whoop, we're just going to stuff that down with our stuffies from grade 2 and forget about them. What were some of the other ones that?
So the other 3 were sleep. So transforming
Oh,
sleep.
yes, yes.
The other was bullshit, the breaking the bullshit myth around happiness.
Yeah,
So about focusing on contentment rather than happiness. And then the third was around stress and
right.
relationship with it. So the 6 were the inner child, the personal and professional boundaries, which you will often express, which was why it came to mind with what you were saying earlier about where do I end and that other person begins and vice
Yeah,
versa in
yeah.
those relationships. So those were the 6. And then the 7th that we designed was the Learning Journal Crash Course as a tool that could be used in all of those courses to be able to explore those. So would that be fair to say that those are probably 6 of the most common aspects of themes that you would say that you find that clients, I don't want to say struggle with, but are just trying to come to terms with, working with, finding tools that they can implement?
I think another one that could be thrown in there is one on communication and another on really just unpacking emotions. And all of those relate to being friends with yourself. That's the next course that I am looking to develop when I'm done the Who Am I course.
Right. So here's another segue. And it was something I really wanted to make sure we got in as I'm looking at the time and going through here. For that decade or so that you have been a counselor, a lot of your work has been with men. And
Mhm.
my experience and observations, reflections, and what I hear from others is that you're really skilled in working with men. So you've worked at a men's residential treatment facility where men would come in for a year, if I recall correctly, in residence, as well as with the John Howard Society, where we live in Prince George and Claytley Territory in BC, with men that I think, if I recall, were mandated to come and take training by the
Some were
courts.
mandated, yeah,
Some were and some chose.
some
And
chose,
then
yeah.
also some work with the Sexual Assault Center as well, working in that area. And often you seem to be finding that that type of work has you working with men. And I'm curious about some of your reflections and thoughts. My speculations is related to some of what we've been talking about and where you come from and how you've been engaged, but you do have a knack for for being able to connect and interact and being able to support men.
Yeah, I had men as clients today, and both of them said, "You kicked my ass again." Not physically. I think it might be part and parcel because I grew up in a locker room. I grew up in a hockey family.
Right.
That is absolutely ripe for stories that no one wants to hear, but nothing bad ever happened. I remember the night that I was coming home from group once. I have been facilitating men's groups for the last, over a decade now. And this particular group was a group that I developed as male survivors of sexual assault. And I called my dad and I just said, "I'm so thankful that I never got hurt." And I was constantly being put in scenarios, not on purpose, but like this was the 80s. And where something could have happened. But I grew up in an environment where it was safe to be around men, and I learned to speak that language. And there was also a strong feminist in me who thought, I will outwork the men. I whatever they can do, I can do better. Peeing standing up, I'm still not great at. But you know what? Maybe with more practice and fortitude, I can get there. But that was what set the foundation for me in just feeling comfortable around men. I grew up in a man's world. I was a farm kid. Um, you know, tried to, I guess, take on jobs that were not typically female dominated: equipment operator, farmer, horse trainer, mechanic. Um, I don't know what else is. Oh, I was a tire tech.
Counselor to men's groups.
What's that, sorry?
Counselor to men's groups as well.
Counselor to men's groups, yeah. And was always, I would start and say, "Hey guys, I know I own a vagina. I get that. I don't know what it's like to be a penis owner, but I did grow up encountering a lot of that world. And so learning the language without judgment, trying my best to just create a space of authenticity. Everyone's got a bullshit meter, regardless of gender. If we can create a space where people can feel like they can show up as they are, that's the most important thing."
So we've been watching a show, a couple of episodes, and it's unique in that the woman, the main character in there, has a bullshit meter. She can detect when people lie. She can't explain exactly, but she just knows. Somebody says something and she says bullshit under her breath. It's a lie. Called Poker Face, I think, if I recall.
Yeah.
And I was curious and I was thinking about this as I was putting some questions together, some of which I've used and some we've gone in other directions. Do you think there's a connection between your work with horses as well as your ability to detect bullshit, especially in men?
1,000%. That's where I learned how to be a counselor. People say, "Where did you go to school?" Well, first it was the farm. And so our lived experiences have such a profound effect on who we become. And a lot of that are transferable skills without even conscious attention. And so for myself, absolutely, I needed to show up as who I was so that I could get the most out of this particular horse. If this horse felt safe to be who he or she was, then we're going to have a beautiful relationship, and they're going to gain confidence so much faster in what they're being asked to do. Most beings, they just want to get along. So if we can show them the way, not in a manipulative way, but in an invitational way where we can invite opportunities to be curious and have fun.
Absolutely. So I want to dig a little bit and go back to this idea of being friends with ourselves. And you were sharing and joking some of this, which sometimes is your nature when you get a little bit uncomfortable, and you may or may not have been. It was an assumption around being friends with yourself. And that idea of this maybe not mentioned in there is you have a strong streak of tomboy in you. You talk about that from a young age. And that this idea where I wanted to push on you a little bit was your own journey about being a friend with yourself. When did it start to shift in you about I don't need to beat everybody. I don't need to show every guy or this guy or that guy that I can beat them down because we've gone through that. Often I tell the story, and I'll interviewers
Go ahead.
prerogative
Yep.
here.
Tell the
When
story.
we met early on, and there was a dike on the river out front of, I think it was at your brother's place, like a big breakwater, and you had flip-flops on. I think I had shoes on, and you had a dress on. And it was pretty early in our relationship, and you had said, "Well, let's race to that sign down there, like 50 meters or something." And off, and I was like, okay. And I thought you were joking. You were actually quite serious with me, and away you went. And I think I caught you pretty quick and ran past. And
Yeah,
what
you
you
kicked my
didn't
ass.
know is I was a sprinter in high school and actually pretty quick. And when we talked about it, and you were like, "No, I actually thought I could beat you in my flip-flops and dress." And I think over time that relationship has shifted in different things from when we go mountain biking together. Can you share a little bit more about that journey
I
of
don't
being
know about
a,
mountain biking so much. I still do kick your ass. When did it shift for me? Let's talk about that.
or
It
has it?
yesterday.
Or has it? And you being friends with yourself because you also are very well known for working yourself to sheer exhaustion. And that hasn't happened, I think, in a few years. Certainly, like, oh, I got to slow down. But this was sort of infamous when I met you. You had a family friend that said, "Oh yeah, Lisa will work 48 hours and then sleep 48 hours. If you got to just watch it because she'll work herself to the bone." But that you've become better friends with yourself, I think, over time in realizing, no, I don't need to beat everyone. I don't need to prove anything. I should just need to be a friend with myself.
So to be honest, it's probably been in the last, I'm gonna say 8 years, 7, 8 years, where that took a major turn for me. I had a pretty big bout of burnout. Um, and that scared me. And I didn't realize that I'd had multiple bouts of burnout in my younger years. I just thought, I was tired. So I would sleep for a couple days because I had just had, a 110-hour work week. What's wrong with
You thought
sleep?
it was normal.
I thought it was normal because that's what I grew up in. When you're a farmer, it's not 9 to 5. It's
Yeah.
24/7, 365 days a year. And I think I was telling you this the other day, one of my earliest memories in relationship to entrepreneurship was I remember my dad had got new business cards and he handed me one and he says, "What did you think of this?" And I look at it and it said, uh, "On call 24 hours." And that didn't mean anything to me as a kid. That was normal. That's like, oh, okay. Like I didn't even give it a second thought. And so the other day when I was reflecting on that, going, wow, that's what I grew up in. That's what I was conditioned for. And that's no one's fault. It's just more of an awareness of that's what was normalized in my life is you just work till exhaustion and then you rest and then you party to exhaustion and then you rinse and repeat again. And then all of a sudden it's time for your funeral. Like that's how life passed.
Hmm.
And learning that time is precious, it wasn't necessarily about work. It was about losing people that I loved and recognizing this is a limited time offer. Being in this body, being this person, and losing people that help me become this person, I thought, at least it's time to start appreciating the person that you are.
Hmm. So funny because I didn't share any of the questions I was going to ask ahead of time. I gave you, a thought. I said, "Oh, I'll probably ask about this and ask about that." And that's where I was leading to with this, because a big part of you and I forming Humanity Academy, going out on our own, becoming solopreneurs or soulpreneurs, as I've been exploring a little bit more as of recent, is this idea of death thinking And I want to go
Mhm.
there in a moment. But before I go there, when you were working in the men's residential treatment facility, and you've written about this on Medium, it's in our new Learning Journal 101 course, is the feeling story emotion cycle, if I've got that right. And certainly what I heard in your previous comments there were some reflections on the stories you were telling yourself and then thinking that through. Can you share a bit more? Because I find this is a really simple yet powerful framework, as often some of the best frameworks can be, is quite simple around that cycle. A bit around, as we'll start wrapping up with a couple more questions, but it's a piece I didn't want to miss because of its simplicity and power to be able to
Mhm.
assist folks.
So I developed the feeling story emotion cycle about 10 years ago, and it was in response to a lot of the men that I was working with, and this is absolutely not a hit against men. It's just this was the environment that I was working in. Would go,
Mm-hmm.
well, I don't understand, how do I get connected to my emotions? And I thought, well, shit, there's got to be a different way to access this, because if we start using language that's not familiar to teach something that's also not familiar, we're not going to get learning. We're actually going to get more confusing or more confusion.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is something that makes sense that could be connected to? And I started to formulate the feeling, story, emotion cycle. And the feeling part is, what is the physical? And for a lot of men and any other gender too, I get that it can be easy to connect with the physical in the sense of, oh, there's tension there or there's pain there. We often don't notice when things feel good. We definitely notice when things don't feel great.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one piece, is the feeling piece. Then the next piece is the story. The story is, what is the narrative attached to what I'm feeling? And then the emotion piece is, what is the label that we are calling this experience, if that makes sense. Now, all those three pieces are all interconnected, right? They don't sit on their own. Every emotion has a story. Every story has a feeling. Every feeling has an emotion, all of that. It's all connected. Now, for the men, this that I was working with, this was a way to connect to the emotion. We wouldn't start there. The place that we would start at is either the story or the feeling. Because the
Mm-hmm.
story is, well, that freaking asshole, he stole my pillow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a pretty clear story. What's the feeling on that? Well, I'm worked up. Oh yeah, what is that? Anger. There's the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And so why does this matter? Because when we bring awareness to something, then we can start to shift it. And that is when I developed the 6 A's of emotion. So it gave us now a framework to work with the emotions that were coming up. In part and parcel with those two frameworks, then I talked about, well, what actually are emotions, because we hear about positive emotions and negative emotions. Those are two bullshit terms I would like to remove.
Or
There's no
being
bad or
emotional,
good,
being
or being
emotional.
emotional.
Yeah.
That's right. When we start to label something good or bad, it starts to change the narrative in our experience of it. And then I'm not going to want to experience something negative, or I'm going to want more positive. This is something that can create addiction, is I need to numb out the bad, but we can't numb out the bad without numbing out the good. So here we are in this conundrum. So how can we shift the language? So if we started to look at negative emotions as, this is an experience of me not getting my needs met. And this is where we're sort of sneaking in that being friends with yourself, is because
Exactly.
I need to be aware of, oh, what are my needs? First, I might need to give myself permission to have needs, right? So exploring, what might this be? Oh, maybe I need a hug. Maybe I need some water. Maybe I need some alone time.
Sleep.
Sleep. Yeah, you can see I am looking tired
Me
today.
too.
I do need some more sleep. So I'll probably have a nap when I get home. And then those emotions that we label as positive or good, that's actually when our needs are getting met. But it's not that simple. We often think of joy, for example, as like a good emotion, but for some people, joy can be the scariest emotion, because their experience maybe growing up was, well, something immediately is going to go bad,
Right.
waiting for the
That's the
other shoe to
story.
drop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the 6 A's?
So the 6 A's, again, that's something that I developed just to work with emotion, any emotion coming up. The first one is awareness. So awareness is basically that noticing you're feeling something, right?
Mhm.
It's just, it's not just the wind. And then the next one is to acknowledge it. So admit that I'm feeling something. Maybe I did attempt to identify what that is. And then the next one, this is often the most difficult for people, is to accept it. Because if I was to accept it, does this mean it's real? Is this going to paint my whole day? Is this going to wreck the next experience? That we were never really taught how to accept something. So that acceptance piece is really important. It doesn't mean you give in or give up. It's just accepting, okay, right now I'm sad. And sometimes right there it gives us permission to actually really feel.
Mhm.
And that's the next step, which is allowing. So that allowing piece is just to give a moment to experience what it is that's actually coming alive in us, as opposed to stuffing it down into that box of shit that so many of us carry around. So allowing it to be there might be letting a tear fall. It might be noticing how tight the chest is. It might be letting myself feel that elated lightness because I'm
Mm.
feeling happy, for example, right? There's different ways to work with this. And then the next one is, this is the fifth step, called affirming. So affirming is just knowing that this emotion is temporary.
Mhm.
That maybe it's a gift to point me to action, right? We are human beings, but we sure like to be human doings. So knowing that there is something that maybe we could do about it, so to act, and that's the last A, which emotion has motion built into it. So how might this emotion need to be moved or not need to be moved through, right? Sadness could be a good example. Sadness to move through, maybe crying is required, or maybe a hug is required, or maybe journaling, writing it out, or listening to music or walking is required. Or if you feel safe enough, maybe just sitting in it is
Just in
required.
solitude. Yep.
That's right. So part of the act can be going back and using the feeling story emotion cycle. So looking at what are the things that are attached to what I'm feeling right now, so they can work back and forth.
Nice. I like it. And so we've included those. Lisa's written articles on Medium about that. And we've included those in the Learning Journals 101 course, which is our first paid course that we've put up. And so when you take that course, you get access to those. And or if you're interested, just reach out. We generally share lots of our stuff for free. We're all part of humanity. So with that, and starting to lead to wrapping up, and some might be say, oh, well, this is sort of a morbid way to go. Something you and I have talked about, and it's been a big part. And I think what I heard you allude to it, because I've got a lot of inside information, but a huge shift for you and I both over the last 5, 6 years has been death. And deaths
Mhm.
in our family, deaths of loved ones, death of friends, loved ones. It's been a huge impact. You'd mentioned your maternal grandmother, but all four of your grandparents have passed in the past 5 years. So two on my side, aunts, uncles, brother-in-laws, friends. And so we've started talking quite openly around this idea of death thinking. And certainly we didn't create it. It's been around for quite some time. And I certainly hear it when you talk about the feeling, emotion, story cycle. You've been present or nearby. I've been directly present for family members that have chosen to go through medically assisted dying. It can be a really
Mhm.
challenging process, but we all die. And once you and I have found this sort of shift in our thinking and our choices, and you've mentioned it, limited time on the planet, we need to have some fun, do the work, those types of things. Wonder if you, as we start to wrap up, could share a little bit of your reflections on this idea of death thinking, but also just that reality of the time we have on the planet, some of the choices, any of the reflections you want to share in thinking about wrapping up and why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Well, I think for me, growing up at a farm, death was part of life.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just this recognition that everything is temporary. We were grain farmers, but we also had animals around, and grain has its own life cycle. You plant it in the spring, unless it's winter wheat or some sort of undercrop. and then it's going to grow up in the spring, and then you harvest it, and then you work it under, and then you rinse and repeat over and over and over. So it's this constant cycle of life and death to nourish
Mm-hmm.
over and over. And so losing things that I loved as well, that was just commonplace. Our most recent experience was putting our dog down, Lou, who was my co-therapist for
Mm-hmm.
10 years. And that was really, really hard. But it also highlights life. Death is the shadow that makes the light shine brighter if we allow it to. And that's not to say all death is fun. It's not. It's a process that is, I feel, invites necessary pain, because those are the times where we can really integrate some of those memories that helped us become who we are, recognize that no one can take that away from us, honor that person's contributions to humanity, just being in our world and knowing that this is all temporary can really help me worry less. I know it can help a lot of other people worry less as well. And we can all get worried, right? Like you and I both quit our jobs because we wanted to do something on our own terms, and we've sort of always been wired that way. And so why not take the leap? It could be an utter and complete failure, but you're never going to know until you try. And like you said, we have this limited time on this planet. Why not do our best with the tools that we have? And in the meantime, we're going to grow as people anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's in the course. Be curious to see if that's some we have death of identities, and that's actually something that is talked about in this sort of hyper political space right now about dead names, those types of things. And it seems to be a shift in dialogue where in some cultures it can be quite openly talked about. It's shifting the story, right? You were talking
Mhm.
about the feeling, story, emotion cycle, and everyone carries one about death and how it gets navigated. You had there's a just a wonderful line that your maternal grandfather had shared, and we were just talking about it on our walk the other day. I think your brother had shared it with you as well. And you have some clients that you're working with that are in sunset stages of their lives. And his line, and it still sticks with me as well, was in his 80s when he was still helping out on the
Mhm.
farm and heading down there. He just said, "Well, I don't really won't know what I want to be when I grow up." If I remember, if that was the line. And I'm just wondering about some of your reflections from that relationship with your grandparents, but also what you're learning about yourself as you work with some of your clients that are in those latter stages of life.
I think that was a pretty profound experience for me. He said, Lisa, I'm 85 years old. I still don't have it all figured out. And to know that he had something similar to say to my brother really validated my experience with him, that he wasn't just saying that to placate the situation or the stage that I was at in life. It was just, that's to me genuinely how he felt. And that took a lot of pressure off. And I feel like this environment that we are living in this post social media way of being, we're so bombarded by this is the way to do it. You know, someone could post something on Facebook completely innocuous and you get all these trolls. That's not how you do it. I can't believe you did it this way. Did you ever think, all this bullshit. And so coming back to more of a simple way of being, taking the pressure off and going, we're here for a limited time. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I mean, there's some things that we could definitely do wrong for sure, right? But just recognizing that we're all on our own unique journey and just slowing down a little bit and maybe celebrating how far we've come already has been pretty powerful.
Yeah, well, and that's often the qualifier I put on what we say. There's no one right way for living. That doesn't mean that we can make right or wrong choices. But
That's
similarly,
right.
when we shift that story about our emotions and saying this is bad and that is good, we can just say it is. It just is. And it'll come and it'll go, just like the tide comes in, tide goes out, harvest happens, all of those types of things. Such a nice way to start to wrap up, I find. And I'm curious, taking some of your grandfather's thoughts there. What are you doing as you're trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up? What is your next little bit to look like? What are you thinking about?
You know what? That's a funny question because I remember a few years ago, quite a few years ago, actually, I had this moment of almost panic of like, holy shit, I am doing what I wanted to be when I grew up. Now what? And I think for me, it's stepping into the vulnerabilities that are being awakened in myself and recognizing that those also exist in a lot of people, and what sorts of things can I create? I've always been an artist my whole life, and I've always loved to create and facilitate. So I think that's the next steps for me, is just continuing to step into who I am and what I have to offer as I unfold in my own growth. I want to say maturity, but that's sort of up for debate.
Well, and there's stories wrapped around those words as there often are. So you had asked me this question when we got near the end of my interview, was that idea of being a fly on the wall. So I'll ask it to you. If I'm a fly on the wall and you're living your ideal day, we didn't even touch on your relationship with art, which is a very long-term relationship. But what does your ideal day look like if we're a fly on the wall and we're watching you go about it?
Well, it's funny that you asked that. It's shifted since I've met you, because I was so wired to just wake up and go to work, as opposed to wake up and just chill out for a bit. So I've kind of adopted that way of being from you and gone, this isn't a bad way to be. So an ideal day for me might be, I got to sleep in, so probably till like 7:30.
7 a.m., 7:30.
Somebody makes me a good coffee. I get to watch the sun come up. I look out the window and I don't see any people or houses. And maybe I get to go for a ride on my horse and then spend the rest of the afternoon painting and come home to my husband's home cooked lasagna. It is like one of my favorite things in the whole world. It was my favorite and became even more of a favorite. It's like my favorite is favorite for dinner. And then maybe a foot rub and a sauna and a cold shower, and then maybe some carrot cake for dessert, maybe a nice glass of wine. And then, oh my God, I fall right to sleep and I stay asleep.
Not bad. Not bad. Anything that you want to share that maybe we didn't cover off, a reflection, a thought, anything bolting back into your mind before we close off?
Well, I think we should do more of these.
Yeah, I think so. Have to maybe interview that guy again that makes that lasagna and does the foot rubs.
I kind of like them.
So, folks, that's Thoughts on Humanity, episode 2. Let us know what you think. Pass us along some thoughts, suggestions. What else would you like to know? Check out the links in the comments for our website, free education courses. We've got a paid education course, and we have got more coming soon.
Thanks for joining us. Bye, human.
Have a good day.